Again, I want to thank you all for coming today to the first lunch lecture in the Tocqueville Project lunch lecture series. Introducing Shane Courtland, who's an assistant professor of philosophy at the University of Minnesota, Duluth. He specializes in moral philosophy, political philosophy, with an emphasis on Thomas Hobbes. Today, he's going to be talking about political absolutism in the United States. So please join me in welcoming Shane Courtland. We've got two applause.
Well, there you go. Yeah.
You haven't even said anything.
I'm already ahead. All right. Well, thank you again. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, everybody here at UNO. Very hospitable. I'm very, very appreciative. So I'm going to talk about something today that is contentious at best, right? So in some sense, when I do philosophy, I like to do philosophy almost on a dare, right? Where I try to see if I can justify something that's not supposed to be justifiable, right? And this project in particular goes all the way back, and I hate that I can even say that now, but all the way back to my dissertation, right, where I started off with an example having to do with the United States government, trying to tie it to Thomas Hobbes. Later on, I published work associated with that, and then I expanded upon this particular example, again, the United States and Thomas Hobbes, for a recent paper, one that I just presented at the Eastern APA, which you're going to get kind of a version of it here, and it's currently under review at Hobbes Studies. So to kind of start this off, I need to kind of introduce the notion of political authority. Right? So imagine if the person next to you were to tell you at this moment, leave this room, right? Just like that. Now, admittedly, you may question, well, who exactly is this person, right? Why would they be saying such a thing to me? Ought I to take them seriously? You know, then again, I just saw Shane, his eyes are sort of twitchy. Maybe it's a good idea if we leave, you know, don't make any sudden moves, but move quietly backwards. You know, all these things could be going through your head at this particular moment. But I want you to note how it changes, and changes relatively quickly. If you imagined that you were in, say, the Army, and the person next to you were your commanding officer, and your commanding officer says, leave this room, right? Now, at that particular moment, there's something extra going on. You don't just go, well, why? You don't start asking your commanding officer questions. You have an order of sorts, right? And because of who the commanding officer is, your commanding officer, that carries forth what we refer to as authority, right? Where by recognizing the authority of your commanding officer, the facts that your commanding officer gave you a command gives you a reason to leave, right? As opposed to just having some Joe Schmo on the street or whoever's next to you give you that. Now, what we try to do in political philosophy is we acknowledge that something like that occurs with the state, right? So the state has this very peculiar role with you, that the state will tell you to do things, but the state isn't just any old entity, right? You know, it's not like some sort of interest group that just says, do this. Because if an interest group told you to do that, you may ask similar questions to what you did when the stranger next to you asked you to do something. You would say, well, who's this group? Why ought I to do it? So on and so forth. But when the state, all things being equal, tells you to do something, the fact that it is the state is supposed to give you a special sort of reason, an authoritative reason for action, right? You go, look at, the state has commanded me to do this. And if I respect the state's authority, right, then I should be doing this thing. Right? Now, of course, political philosophy is very concerned about that sort of relationship, the relationship of political authority. It wants to know where it originates from, right? It wants to know when it's legitimate, right? When you ought to obey. It also wants to know to what extent, what kind of things does it cover? How far wide is authority in this particular regard? There's plenty of sort of debates here. Hobbes has a rather sort of extreme answer when it comes to the extent of political authority. For Hobbes, he's referred to as an absolutist, right? And Hobbesian absolutism basically makes this sort of claim that not only is authority undivided into one entity, right? And that could be, say, a king or a queen, some sort of monarchy, or it could be in an aristocracy, a group of individuals, or it could be in a democracy, right? But it's in this one sort of body, so it's undivided. And the other sort of claim that makes it absolute is that its extent, the different topics and subjects it covers all things being equal, right? So it has authority over pretty much everything, right? Now, this idea has terrorized people since Hobbes uttered it, right? So this was a crazy idea in the 1600s, right? Now, more crazy is that I want to say, in a sense, I can characterize our contemporary United States system as the sort of Hobbesian absolute system that I've just described, right? Now, the reason why this seems, I'd say, at least on the face of it, crazy, is that usually the way that we characterize our contemporary United States government is the exact opposite of absolute sovereignty, the exact opposite of having this sort of absolute authority that we've been talking about. So the way we usually characterize it is first off, it's divided, severely divided, right? We have different branches of government, right? Judicial branch, legislative branch, executive branch. Each of them have powers that check and balance the other branches. So no one entity seemingly holds it all, right? We also have different levels, federal, state, local, as well, which again seems divided, right? On top of all of this, it seems like it is also limited in what it has authority over, right? In particular, we could point to, say, the Constitution. And the Constitution seems to have pretty straightforward checks on what a government can and cannot say or do, right? And so it seems like, and this is often given in the literature and pretty much anywhere that you go, the big counterexample as to a case where you have a system of government different than what Hobbes envisioned is the contemporary United States government, right? And it's often used as a sort of counterexample to the Hobbesian-like system. See, there's the United States government, it's doing quite well. Doesn't Hobbes have egg on his face, right? So what my goal was to kind of show, well, it's really not that different. That in actuality, it seems as though it's a separate and different style. But in actuality, it's primarily a Hobbesian form of absolutism, right? So that's the sort of nature of the project. Now, as far as what I mean by absolute sovereignty, sovereignty is just a kind of fancy way of me describing a sort of system of political authority, a system of authoritative reasons. Now, in order to have sovereignty in the Hobbesian system, we need two concepts fulfilled, right? The first concept is that we need hierarchy. What hierarchy is that when we have different entities in a system, a political system, they have to have the relationships of either subordination or superordination, right? On top of hierarchy, we also need closure. Closure means that with this hierarchical system, at some point it has to stop. There has to be, how would you say, the one authority to rule them all, so to speak. Now, to give you a sort of a sample system, if you will. Imagine again, let's go back to the Army, for example. We have a sergeant, we have a colonel, and say we have a general. And the general is where we're going to stop. We're going to put the president aside for a second, right? So, the sergeant is subordinate to the colonel, right? The colonel is subordinate to the general. The general is superordinate, right, to the colonel. The colonel is superordinate to the sergeant. So what that means essentially is that the sergeant can do stuff until there are commands given by the colonel. And then the sergeant views the colonel, because of political authority of some sort, right, as giving authoritative reasons for actions and obeys, right? But of course, even if the colonel gives a command, the colonel can be overruled by the general, right? And the general issues, of course, authoritative reasons for actions. Now, at the top of this hierarchy, the general. The general has nobody above him or her, right? At the top of the hierarchical chain, provides closure to it, right? These are the two things that are required for sovereignty, according to Hobbes. And we can see it, if you look at a quote, it's going to be your key quote A, right? And seeing how I do a lot of history of philosophy, unfortunately, I have to refer to quotes. All right, so if you look at this comes by way of de Cive. For if its power is to be limited, it has to be limited by a greater power. For the one that sets the limits must have greater power than the one restrained by the limits. The restraining power, therefore, is either without limit or is restrained in its turn by a greater power. And so it will come down at last to a power without other limit than set by the strength of all the sit-ins together in its full extent. That, of course, full extent is, in fact, the sovereign, according to Hobbes. Now, it's my contention that when Hobbes talks about absolute sovereignty, it is just using these two concepts, hierarchy and closure, and nothing more. All right? I refer to it as the thin conception of absolute sovereignty. Now look at your key elements section. It's important enough where I had to have this written down. With Hobbes' analytic conception of sovereignty, the concepts of closure and hierarchy grow into what I refer to as the thin conception of absolute sovereignty. Under this conception, the term absolute sovereignty is largely redundant. It is the only absolute in that it ensures that the core concepts of sovereignty, closure and hierarchy are satisfied. Beyond these core concepts, the thin conception remains silent. It is my contention that this is the most defensible interpretation of Hobbesian absolute sovereignty. Now, you'll note, if any of you are familiar with Hobbes, that often when we talk about Hobbesian absolute sovereignty, it's not just usually in this thin conception. There are other things that are also associated with it. And that goes to the next part, part B, that's the thick conception. I'm not going to spend a lot of time in the discussion right now, but of course, if people want to talk about it during the question period, I'm more than willing to. I can just give a brief pointing to it. Usually in a sort of thicker version of absolutism that people associate with Hobbes, they'll talk about how Hobbes maybe endorses monarchy, right? Thinks that's the best system. They'll talk about how Hobbes, on top of that, says that we should probably limit the free expression of ideas to almost a crushing point and civil liberties, right? This is very contentious, at least to, I think, most Hobbesian scholars. Most Hobbesian scholars would disagree that this is even a good interpretation of Hobbes, but it's common. It's really common. We can discuss that later. Now, that being said, let's move right to the U.S., all right, and see how it fits with the United States. So, ultimately, the United States system has a sort of structure that Hobbes, in a certain sense, has already envisioned, right? This is not, how would you say, a completely new thing to Hobbes. And so look again at the key quote letter B, sorry. Key quote letter B. This comes from the Elements of Law, one of Hobbes' first works, right? And it describes a system that is similar. But though the sovereignty be not mixed, but always be either simple democracy or simple aristocracy, or pure monarchy, nevertheless, in the administration thereof, all those sorts of government may have place subordinate. So also in a monarchy there may be a council aristocratical of men chosen by the monarch, or democratical of men chosen by the consent, the monarch permitting, of all the particular men of the commonwealth. Here, this is key. And this mixture is it that imposeth as if it were a mixture of sovereignty. As if a man should think, because the great council of Venice doth nothing ordinarily but choose magistrates, that therefore their part of the sovereignty is only choosing of magistrates, and the making of war and peace and laws were not theirs, but the part of such councillors as the appointed thereto, whereas it is also part of these to do it, but subordinately, the supreme authority, therefore, thereof being in the great council that choose them. So, what I want you to see here is Hobbes acknowledges that many bodies within the sort of political hierarchy, right, they can have a role actually administering portions of the authority, as long as the authority doesn't ultimately rest with them, right? So you can have within a system, if you will, magistrates that will do certain jobs. Hobbes, of course, does not envision, even in a monarchy, the one, say, king or queen doing everything, right? Of course, that king or queen has, a limited amount of attention, so they'll delegate. But the important point is, at any moment, the king or queen can pull the delegation back, right? Ultimate authority rests with, in that case, the king or the queen. Now, this is also true in other systems of government that Hobbes acknowledges. Democracies, this is true. Aristocracies, this is true. You can delegate without having a divided sovereignty, according to Hobbes, right? And the problem that many people get, according to Hobbes, is that people will view this divided administration as though it were true divided sovereignty, when in actuality it's not. It's just having somebody delegate authority when the authority doesn't ultimately remain with them, right? Now, as far as the United States government then, I think it gives us a different way of viewing it. Turn back to the key elements, C and D. Right? Instead of viewing the branches as a division of sovereignty, I view the people, right, as the undivided sovereign. The popular sovereign possesses all of the marks of sovereignty. It delegates authority to certain trustees, magistrates, or branches. At any time, the popular sovereign can legally rescind or reconstruct such a delegation. If it does not like the executive branch, the popular sovereign can legally eliminate it. If it dislikes an amendment of the Constitution, the sovereign has the legal right to rescind such amendment. According to my view, the people are an instantiation here of a Hobbesian absolute sovereign. Again, here in the thin sense, right? Representing hierarchy and closure. Now, look at the next part. Here's where I actually kind of give you, I think, the sort of straightforward structure that I'm trying to look for. So the model of the United States as a form of political authority that satisfies the conditions posed by the thin conception. It could be characterized as a three-entity system. If you take the branches of government, judiciary, legislature, and executive, those are subordinate to the Constitution. The Constitution is subordinate to the people, to coup. That's where it stops. Given such a system, the following assertions apply. Here, the three branches of government are superordinate to the Constitution, subordinate to the Constitution, which is subordinate to the people. The people are subordinate to no other entity, legally speaking, and are the subordinate to both the Constitution and the three branches of government. Again, legally speaking, this means that the people's commands are automatically authoritative reasons for action, right? So what they say goes, essentially. The Constitution's commands, on the other hand, are only authoritative insofar as the people fail to overturn them. The people end the regress of authoritative hierarchy and thereby are the terminus ultimus of political authority. They are, in other words, the Hobbesian absolute sovereign. Right? Now, showing this, I'm going to take a portion from Madison's Federalist number 49, and that's key quote number C, or letter C, I did it again. All right? Look at what Madison says, and I want you to see how this fits the structure I just discussed. As the people are the only legitimate fountain of power, and it is from them that the constitutional charter, under which the several branches of government hold their power, is derived, it seems strictly consonant to the Republican theory to recur to the same original authority, not only whenever it may be necessary to enlarge, diminish, or new model the powers of government, but also whenever any one of the departments may commit encroachments on the chartered authorities of the others, without an appeal to the people themselves, who, as the grantors of the commissions, can alone declare its true meaning and enforce its observance. So the people here sit at the top. And this isn't a shock completely, because if anything, this seems to at least detail the social contract at the core of our particular government. What I think is interesting about it, too, is that the people don't have this sort of one-off role. It's not as though we had this contract and everybody went home and the people are never, ever consulted again, right? They have the ability to new model. They have the ability to judge. They have the ability to alter and eliminate. All of it, right? They retain authority. Right? Just like we talked about with the Council of Venice, right? They retain authority. Now, to kind of make this clear, why don't we use a thought experiment? So, a lot of times people point to the Constitution as this sort of great way in which we can limit political authority, or limit the authority of the state. So, if a state, for example, were to declare all of a sudden that we're going to have a particular state religion, right? People, of course, point to the First Amendment, say, you lack the authority to do that, right? It's limited by this particular document. Well, that may be true in the sense that if, say, Congress decided to do that, or if, say, the president decided to do that, or if, say, any particular state government, like, say, Louisiana, decided to do that, right? But imagine something different. Imagine that we go through, say, Article 5, the Constitution, and we decide to rescind the First Amendment and replace it with a Bizarro First Amendment. Now, the Bizarro First Amendment just negates everything of the First Amendment, right? Now, first we have a state religion. On top of having a state religion, freedom of speech has been rescinded completely. Right? Now, the question here is there anything that is illegal that has been done? Now, don't get me wrong, right? We can look at the enactment of the Bizarro First Amendment and say, yeah, it seems like a dumb idea for a number of reasons, right? And Hobbes would probably be on board with that, and we can discuss that later. But nonetheless, the people, at least as I'm describing them, would have the authority to do that. They would have the authority to rescind it completely, right? They would not be doing anything illegal. They are the underwriters. They are the ones that construct it. It's just the will, if you will, of the people. That is the Constitution. And if they change their will, the Constitution itself changes. Right? That's the particular move. Now, this gives us, a slightly different way to view things like, say, the Federalist Papers. Right? And in particular, you can see it, say, in Federalist number 10, which is probably, I'd say, arguably probably the most famous Federalist paper. Right? And in Federalist number 10, Madison is really concerned with factions. Right? And the faction that he's most concerned with is not a minority faction, right? A small group of people who are very energetic. He's concerned much more so with the majority faction, right? Because the majority faction, it seems like, can kind of take control of the government a lot easier. And so he's very worried about this. His proposal, however, I think, is very telling. His proposal in Federalist number 10 is not to all of a sudden create a super document that will render everything that a majority faction does that's considered to be moral or heinous or anything bad like that as being ipso facto illegal, right? Like some sort of strong natural law theory. He doesn't do that. He doesn't create another super body to provide a check on majority factions to ensure that they don't do things that are nasty. No, his move is to extend the sphere, right? To take a majority faction and make it into a national majority faction, right? And that would, according to Madison, make it less likely that the majority faction will become tyrannical. Less likely, but not impossible, just less likely. And so what I want to argue is that the way that we could view kind of what's happening with the construction of our particular American system is not so much that they were going, we want to ensure there's no such thing as absolute sovereignty here. Right? Instead, it was much more along the lines of, we want to ensure that we get the right absolute sovereign. And so it's more of a discussion of types. Right? And so I think the mistake, usually when it comes to viewing our contemporary system, is viewing it as a sort of debate between absolutism and non-absolutism, when in actuality it's a debate which ultimately we're going to have to preserve some form of absolute government, the way that I've defined it within absolutism. But we want to make sure we get the right entity for the job. We don't want a monarchy, we don't want an aristocracy, we want a democracy, but we want a specific type of democracy, an extended sphere democracy, right? One that's less likely, right, to be tyrannical. And this debate, we see it in Hobbes. Now, of course, Hobbes, unfortunately, comes to a different conclusion on what form of absolute sovereignty he likes. You know, he likes monarchy. Right? That's the way he wants to go. He's very skeptical of democracy. But nonetheless, he doesn't say that a democracy is less of an absolute sovereign. It's still an absolute sovereign, according to Hobbes. And so likewise, I would say the same thing here about the American system. Still an absolute sovereign. Now, I feel it's important that at this point I address sort of a common objection. And after I address this sort of common objection, I think it'd be helpful at that point that we go to the questions. So the common objection that usually comes up right about here is that people realize that the way that this sovereign rules is often through, say, Article 5 of the Constitution. Right? And when they say that, the next move that they want to make is they go, well, if it's through Article 5, aren't you then saying that in some sense the Constitution has power over the sovereign? Right? The people, in that regard. Because Article 5 then is telling them how to rule in a sense. Now, the response to this, slightly tricky, Article 5 just marks the identity of the sovereign. Right? With popular sovereigns in particular, and this has a long history within the Hobbesian corpus, it is hard to determine who the sovereign is as opposed to just a mob of people. Right? So we need some sort of way to demarcate what the sovereign is. My claim is that Article 5 is just claiming this is the sovereign, this decision procedure. Right? That's it. Other than that, there are no limitations placed upon that sovereign. No substantive limitations. They can declare any particular amendment that they want at any time. Now, there were initially two exceptions to that. One of them was an exception that couldn't be changed. I think it had to do with slave voting in 1888 in the slave states. The Sunset Clause is passed, right? It was going to be overturned. I think 1888 was the last year that could happen. The other one is you couldn't get rid of, what was it? Equal representation in the Senate, right? And that was actually in Article 5. And so the other sort of move here with this objection is to say, well, look, there does seem to be some substantive limitation in that you cannot, for example, claim that, say, less populous states get less Senate representation. This is an easy move, too. All we have to do, right, to preserve the absolutism of this particular sovereign is to say, well, we just do two amendments. First Amendment, we abolish the Senate, strike it, and here's the thing. It was actually done in the 1900s. The amendment like this was proposed, although it was proposed for other reasons. Right? So there is a history associated with this. Abolish the Senate. Then we create a new body. We'll call it the Zenate with a Z that has a lack of equal votes between states, equal representation. That's perfectly legitimate, right? And so my point here is that there are no substantive limits on this particular decision procedure. The decision procedure I'm pointing to is Article 5 within the Constitution. Since there is no substantive limitation upon that, it is a Hobbesian sovereign in the thin sense, meaning that it's at the top of the authoritative hierarchy, and everything it issues are authoritative reasons for action. It is legally unbounded. Right? It can command whatever it will, and therefore never do anything illegal. Right? And so in that particular sense, it is an absolute sovereign. And the mistake that other people have had up to this point is that they do not pay attention to this particular element of the Constitution. They fail to understand the popularness of our democracy, and they refer to the branches of the government instead. Right? But if they refer to the popularness of it, the popular government, popular sovereignty, the absolutism, I think, is readily apparent. So at this point, I'll let us discuss. If you want, I'll ask or answer questions. I could ask questions, too, if you like. Yes?
So I'm just thinking about Supreme Court judges, and they're operating under the Constitution, but it seems like you're saying that pretty much any change would be possible as long as the people want it.
Yep.
I'm wondering whether the Supreme Court judges should be a direct reflection of the people, or if they should still operate under the Constitution and not try to create contradiction.
So I don't know if I'm going to have a particular role in judicial interpretation here. The big thing about it is that ultimately I would say that, and I don't know if this is going to answer your question or not, the judges could be circumvented by the people with absolute authority here, right? So say that, Scalia, just to pick one, right, has this particular view of the Constitution. And when we look at it and the people then go, yeah, that's heinous, but because of Scalia's role, it seems to be, allotted for as an interpretation, da-da-da-da-da. Well, we could just rewrite the Constitution by the new amendment, and then Scalia would have to obey, right, at that point. So ultimately, even though the judges have a rule interpreting the laws, it's not a final interpretation, because we can cast new laws specifically clarifying what we meant. New amendments that say, no, in particular, this is what this means. And then at that point, Scalia's hands are bound, right? He has no authority then to create an alternate interpretation that would violate that. So although the Supreme Court justices play a role in interpreting law, right, it's not a final role in the system. Mm-hmm. Yes?
Okay, so essentially it's a never-ending loop. As it finally enters a vote, like here right now, we will come to a vote on any subject, and that will be the end of it.
Yeah.
If we can't settle on or agree on it, we will take it to a higher power. Therefore, it's no longer answering to ourselves. So we should always have the vote whatever we want.
Okay.
According to the Fifth Amendment.
So,
like, the people would have to answer to their own vote.
They would in a sense, because, I mean, in a sense, individuals are under the authority of the people, even though they play a role with the people. So similarly, if you just take a democracy of some sort, just any democracy in here, so say this was a democracy. In a sense, the sovereign then in this democracy, just this classroom, is the decision procedure. And it's going to go yay or nay. And we may say the decision procedure is majority rules, right? Now, you play sort of a dual role here. You participate, in a sense, in that decision procedure, but you're also under that decision procedure's thumb, right? So in a sense, you have to abide by what that decision procedure spits out, right? But the decision procedure could be the final decision procedure, meaning that there are no procedures higher than it, right? So that particular thing would be the ultimate stopping point in political authority within the system. And for the United States system, I think the best and most obvious way to point would be at Article 5. Nothing trumps it. It's done at that point. Yeah.
So looking at the U.S. government as absolute sovereign, that would technically mean that there is a possibility that the people, as opposed to the person, individual, as you were saying, the people being the absolute sovereign could possibly become corrupt. So, has it?
Well, I don't know. It's always a possibility. So here's the thing, and this has been around for as long as politics has been around, right? Whenever you have somebody, and Hobbes flats out states, I'm trying to remember where he states it. It could either be in Behemoth or De Cive. Wherever you have the power to protect, you also have the power to oppress, right? And there's really no way around that. And Hobbes views that as sort of, how would you say, an unfortunate ill that we have to accept. Now, that being the case then, there's nothing preventing us from casting forth monstrous laws, right? And making mistakes. I mean, we've changed our mind. I mean, you can look at the Prohibition, for example, right? We changed our mind there. And not to mention we've had obviously horrible things within the Constitution, right? Having to do with slavery and whatnot. So in those particular cases, you can look at that and say, yeah, those are immoral, right? But nonetheless, the way that political authority works, and the reason why we have political authority, is that it allows us some manner to go ahead when there's disagreement on what is moral and immoral, right? And so authority kind of fills, in some sense, this sort of vacuum of overarching unanimous agreement with particular moral claims. Now, can it go wrong? Of course it can. And the goal of, creating a legitimate political authority is try to find the best one that's less likely to go wrong, right? Now, what I was trying to do here with this particular project is to say that the big debate then is not a debate between absolute authority versus non-absolute authority, but the debate is between what would be the best entity using absolute authority, right? That's where the debate should be. Now, can it go wrong? Always. Has it gone wrong in the United States? Well, it depends, I guess, on what your politics is, right? So depending on your politics, you're going to say, we got to get this, United States back on track, right? It's seriously off the track. You have other people on the other hand saying, well, it's good, but there are errors here. There's people kind of getting in the way. And so we're having this sort of discussion. Yeah.
And would that make it divided?
Well, no, I mean, think of it.
We don't want that government anymore.
Yeah.
And now we're on, let's pick something new. Let's all come together and pick something new while the government would still want it to be exactly like it is. Yeah, so what I want you to think about it this way, just before we get to the next question. John Stewart had this great line, right, when he was dealing with the people who were responsible for, I think, the latest, it was Charlie Hebdo stuff, right, where if you look at our particular government right now, and we often, look at it how divided it seems and how much we're at each other's throat, but as John Stewart points out, we're all still playing for team civilization, right, as opposed to where people, just take guns and gun down the people they disagree with. So what I think is important here, even though we disagree, right, as how the outcome comes about, we still view them as authoritative decisions for action. So we still view the United States as casting laws even when we disagree, even when we know there's disagreement, because we respect the procedure. We view the authority in the procedure. And because of that, even though we disagree, we say, okay, I see that you have authority, I will obey. Yes?
Democracy as a mob rule, it's a mob rule. It only works as long as, people have agreed to a certain set of values, like in our country, we have traditional work. Like we saw recently an election in Egypt
Yeah.
where people have such a radical view of what they want, like Sharia law,
Mhm.
where they have absolutely no tolerance for minorities. So therefore, democracy is subordinate, I want to say, to the higher values of the people who create systems of democracy.
Well, if people don't respect, how would you say, the procedure they're using, in a certain sense, they don't view it as having any sort of authority at all, right? Now, as far as democracies themselves picking heinous, how would you say, laws that are, how would you say, destructive of minority rights, yeah, that can happen. Just like there can be bad kings and queens who are destructive of various people and things. This happens no matter what form of government. And I think the interesting question that we need to have here is that, well, what form of government is the most appropriate form of government? And there may not be a universal answer for all peoples at all times, right? It's most likely a much more complicated question than that. And I think our particular problem that we've had is that we've tried to import our particular system or systems like it and just said, well, here it is, and just assumed it was going to flower right up, right? When there needs to be a lot of this background stuff that you're talking about.
I was up, after post-World War II Europe in Austria, and we know Austria, was a weak monarchy when it fell, before Hitler, because people really did not know how to govern themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And after World War II, Austria was under, the rule of the Allied forces for 10 years before they gained, independence or neutrality, because democracy has to be a process. People can't just, grow from one generation to the next, start a democracy, because they have to be trained to think that way. They need to train an entire generation, basically.
I think it's true. I mean, it's not something that can be imported. It has to be grown.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And are you familiar with the work of Gödel? I want to think it was a friend of Albert Einstein.
I think so. The name sounds familiar. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, the one who says that, he was a brilliant thinker, mathematician.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So he said, he studied the U.S., was Constitution or whatever, and he found a weakness where he said it is prone to fall into tyranny at one point.
Yeah.
And I know, this is a critical system after studying, different governments. There's usually a turning point of like 250 years, 300 years into a government, where it kind of just falls apart, basically, because there's a inherent weakness in it. And you see, the United States at that point where we're getting so afraid, where we could self-destruct, basically.
Well, if we could, I don't know if I could pinpoint exactly where the ultimate stress fractures would be, right? I mean, because there are so many different things that can undermine a commonwealth or a government or anything to that effect, and it could be everything from resources to climate, it could be, financial markets. It's a complicated mess to say what will bring it down, right? There is always a concern that people, of course, are doomsaying at times too. So honestly, I don't know. I mean, it's the best one. Yeah. Chris.
So how would you respond to the objection that it seems like what you described in terms of the people being sovereign in the U.S., that seems to be how it works when it comes to the rules and how it's supposed to be.
Yeah.
But in practice, it looks nothing like that. Right? So in practice, there are rules in place.
Mm-hmm.
The rules allow the people to speak up in a certain way, but it's kind of like traveling in the NBA, where it doesn't get enforced. That it's really, you really think that people can operate at the same level in the U.S. in practice as Hobbes would be looking at when Hobbes is talking about the sovereign function?
Yeah, no, right? So first off, I don't think Hobbes envisioned anything like what we had. When he viewed democracy, his understanding of democracy was not like the large, wide, expanded democracy we currently possess. What?
We don't want democracy.
Well, with a small d, in a sense, not a direct democracy, right? But it is a popular form of government, right, where there is an electoral process involved. Right? Now, it's not a simple democracy in which just majority rules, we all get together, and vote on policies directly. So it's this more sort of complicated mess, but I still say it's characterized as a democracy in a sense. I don't think that's an inappropriate use of the word. But I wouldn't say it's a simple democracy. And so I don't think he'd envision that. But I think the core of his ideas, namely that there needs to be decision procedures, right, that are ultimate decision procedures, and it could be anything from a monarch, an aristocracy, to a democratic decision procedure, and that democratic decision procedure could take a number of different sort of forms.
So we have procedures right now that limit what the people can do. So
what procedures are those?
So let's say that you took a poll, right, and it turns out that a significant percentage of the people believe that X was a bad law. What is their mechanism for changing the law?
X amount of people? It depends how big X is.
X is greater than the majority.
Well, it would have
X
to.
at 80 or 90%.
It would still have to fit into the decision procedure that creates the decision. I mean, so essentially, it'd have to still be in the form where it could amend the Constitution.
Okay, so aren't then the people still subjected to the laws?
No.
The laws sit over.
Well, individuals are. Even the mob is, a large group of the mob. But we have to have a definition of what constitutes the sovereign. And the definition of what constitutes the sovereign would be this particular decision procedure I gave you.
That's fair. Why not? So look, when you on D.
Yeah.
You've got three branches of government, then you've got the Constitution, and then you've got.
Yes.
Why isn't the Constitution and the laws? Why or the decision-making procedure? Why isn't that above the people?
The people just are the decision procedure, right? So we usually refer to the people as that, right? It's just a shorthand. If it'd be more comfortable, I can just say that, but this best fits with the older documents that we have, the Federalist Papers and so forth. But the best interpretation of Hobbes, as far as I can tell, is that in a democratic sort of government, the people do rule, but you have to be careful about what you call the people as opposed to a mere mob, right? And the people are what's, constituted by the decision procedure.
And in practice, you think that's how we're functioning in the U.S. So that's
well,
how we're...
in practice, I don't know if that would undermine me even if I said no, right? So essentially, this is a normative theory of government, right? And so what we could say is in that, in some sense, there has been some sort of, how would you say, inappropriate take of authority because people haven't been following the procedure that actually has authority. So even if I granted your claim, which I'm not sure that I'm going to, but even if I did, that wouldn't undermine the case I just gave here, because all I want to say is that the system of authority, this normative system, fits absolutism.
Sure, but if people fail to follow a set of rules long enough so that no one's been following the rules anymore, would you say that they're even in place in any significant way?
People are not following.
Not the people in this sense.
Yeah.
The people in the making the decisions.
So individuals. So they fail to follow.
And I'm not just saying individuals. It could be the people that hold certain offices.
Not necessarily, right? So it depends. This is complicated in the sense that it's really going to depend upon whether or not you could view the sovereign as tacitly allowing something through an action. So depending on what legal philosopher you like, right? H.L.A. Hart was not really big on board with this. This notion that the sovereign just allows things by an action. Right? The sovereign has to be somewhat more active for Hart. But I don't think Hobbes is for that. Hobbes admits you could have a lazy sovereign that just doesn't. And if the sovereign doesn't act, the sovereign is allowing it to happen, and thereby it's done by the sovereign's authority.
So I'll get back and one more.
Yeah.
What would a divided sovereign look like then?
The Articles of Confederation is a good example. So in the longer version of the paper, I go through the Articles of Confederation as a clear example of a true divided sovereignty, where you've divided the marks, the ability to rule through different entities, both the state versus the national. So you give the power of the national government to say tax, but not the power to extract the taxes, right? And so they have authority at the national level, but their authority is handicapped by the authority given to the states and the requirement of unanimity for any changes.
Okay, sorry, I'll ask one more question. Why then, under the Articles of Confederation, why are the people sitting around
Because there's no authoritative reasons, because it requires unanimity for change, right? So we need to have something. A procedure can't be unanimous, because unanimity does not then require you to act off a, exclusionary reason for action, which would be authority, because you just have to act on your own balance of reasons. So whenever you have a requirement for unanimity, right, at that point then you're recognizing sovereignty of the individuals that you require the unanimity from. You're not creating this sort of authoritative reason for action that others have to bow to even if they disagree. It's also true with cases, not just, say, the Articles of Confederation, but, say, if you're going to take the UN, right, and the Security Council. The requirement of that particular council, you recognize their authority because they all have veto power on anything, right? And so if that were a form of, and the reason I don't focus on it because it doesn't seem as clearly a form of a national government as the Articles of Confederation did, right? And it's not as divided, but nonetheless, it does have this particular structure in which there's veto power by separate entities that basically stalls constantly. And that's the problem. Hierarchy is violated. When hierarchy is violated, we have issues. And that's why we had to take down the Articles of Confederation. We needed to reestablish the hierarchy. I had another hand. Did you want to get in?
No.
All right, cool. Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking on how you say the people are at the top of this hierarchy. And it's something that she said made me think about it was, instead of the people, it's more like the values of those people. And it made me think of a lot of nations in Africa, Asia, where they say, well, we're going to have a democracy.
Yep.
So let's have a democracy. But it ends up being those strong values of the majority of the people that just, it's really the top of the hierarchy, those accepted values of them, those people.
I'm not disagreeing, but the problem with values is that without people, they don't do anything, right? They're just free-floating out there, and you need people who possess the values in order to make the moves, right? So I would admit that, say, a democracy where you have people who lack the values will not support the decision procedure that's a part of the democracy, and that's the problem. That you need people who support the decision procedure in order for it to be a functioning democracy. But nonetheless, you need people, right? And those people have to be there in order for it to be any sort of system of government. Values by itself will not, how would you say, provide coercion. Or values by itself will not provide interpretation of those very values. Right. Do you want to get in? No? Yep, either way.
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing with our democracy now, I mean, do we really have a democracy? First of all, it's a two-party system. Do we really get the representation? I mean, other countries have 8 or 12 parties, at least 4 major players in government.
Yeah.
Because can you really have, because, I mean, and then I also see our democracy being hijacked by corporations, lobbies, corporates, $billions by politicians, people practicing rational ignorance because they feel it's too complicated, I don't understand it anyway, it doesn't make a difference what I say, believe anyway. So what we have really is not our values represented anymore, but the values of the corporations who want to make money off us, who don't want to pay taxes, et cetera, et cetera. And I just think this is one of our major crises right now that we have in our country.
Well, a couple things, right? So one, even if I were to grant what you were going to say, a democracy's existence doesn't necessarily mean it's well-functioning, right? So it's still, we could say it's a democratic form, but you're going to say there are things that maybe are compromising. But then again, I don't know. Even if we had multi-parties in there, I don't necessarily know if that would be necessarily better, right? There would still be, how would you say, force sort of consensus. It would just happen after the election, right? In various forms of, governments where you'd have, minority parties getting together with some other parties to construct a majority and then doing it that way. And so I don't know if there's ever a sort of smoking bullet in this regard. And I'm kind of open to these ideas. The only thing I'm really claiming here is there has to be a hierarchy of some sort, right? And there has to be closure of some sort.
Yeah, but what do you think about corporations, taking part, as not, they're not registered voters other than people, but yet they have much greater share of their, values represented than the state.
We can destroy corporations. Those are, if anything, legal entities, which are subject, basically, of course, to our laws to the point where we can actually just declare they don't exist anymore. We have that ability. And so what I could claim then is that our particular sovereign is fine with it because the sovereign allows it to happen and could get rid of corporations at any moment, right, in a sense. I saw another hand over here. Yes?
Yes, what I was saying was the people at the top. This is another thing she said. It's more like a sector of the people. And that sector may be as big as small as we can all think of.
Yep.
But it's that sector of the people. And then other people, another sector of the people that's subordinate to them.
Okay. So maybe, and that's fine, I guess. I'm trying to think. So the sector of the people.
Right. The people is pretty broad. When you're thinking in terms of our particular democracy.
Yeah. So the people that I have is articulated just as this decision procedure. So it's not necessarily even, this is what makes, I think, somewhat deceptive, a body of individuals per se, right? So it's not like I could just grab the people and shove them all in a room. That wouldn't be enough because I couldn't distinguish them from a mere mob, right? The people then have to be articulated by this procedure as well, right? And it's that procedure that is, I would say, even as a necessary condition, right? Without that procedure, they can't rule, right? They're not a thing in this thing. They're not a thing that does any sort of, how would you say, authoritative actions. Right? Yes?
As far as in being in the opposite place of the United States, it has to be another structure created. Like somewhere along the line, the United States modeled their government off of a monarchy. Similar but different. So they brought it here and it got corrupted along the way. It had to be by money, so that happened. But now the people still being what they intended it to be. The vote of everybody being represented by a person who would represent, a state or a county, who are represented by, a group of the states who go to Washington. So it's the same thing, but it stopped being about the vote of all the way down to the people in this room. It's just now we've been kind of set since the 1700s on the exact same government. It kind of got filtered out. Now it's like an umbrella government that's starting to be to where that umbrella is corrupt.
Well, think of it.
We gotta break it all the way down.
And it's not like I'm disagreeing with you. So think of it this way. Imagine we lived in a monarchy, right? And the monarch that we have right now is particularly stupid. No, it just happens to be the case, right? He's kind of a mouth breather, drools a lot, the whole 9 yards. Now, it doesn't make it any less of a monarchy per se, right, as far as the structure. It's not a good monarchy, right? There's definitely, say, virtues that the monarch should embody that the monarch does not, and it'd be good for us to find some way to help the monarch do that, right? So what I want to say is that the structure, as far as political authority is concerned, wouldn't have been altered. And likewise, here, even though we have, say, a democracy which you may have viewed as going astray, right? It's still an absolute authoritative sort of system, although a system that you would hope would get better values in order for it to cast forth better judgments and therefore get better laws. I don't disagree.
Yeah, I mean,
in that sense.
Therefore being said, we have to now redefine what we are saying is the king or queen.
Yeah, but the king or queen here then would just be this sort of procedure I gave you, because it has the absolute authority.
It has to, the procedure, the authoritative, the procedure has to change.
Why does the procedure have to change? I mean, why is the procedure faulty as opposed to the people who comprise it?
Because the consensus disagrees.
And that's fine.
I think that if the consensus disagrees, it's no longer the people's authoritative decision. We no longer agree with what we have to deal with.
I think it's fine because we don't require unanimity to cast laws, right? And I think even disagreement can be quite healthy.
Yeah.
We get a lot from it in a democracy, because there's many, of course, systems of democracies. Do you want to? Okay.
But what someone else was saying is the percentage. Yeah. Now, if 70% is saying that we're not messing with this, then we no longer agree. And
okay.
I do not think right now that the percentage is being dictated in the authoritative decision.
Well,
no longer.
So are you saying that because the percentage of the people do not agree, it ceases to be a democracy?
Not that it ceases to be a democracy.
Yes.
That the people, the top of the hierarchy is kind of construed into more sectors. It's not 60-40. It's not on 55-40. It's not split.
Yeah.
It's like one way or the other. It's like a big difference separating what we really want and what's really going on.
We're assuming there's a people separate from the decision procedure, and there isn't.
The decision procedure is the answer, being the people no longer agree with the decision procedure anymore.
There is no people separate from the decision procedure.
So what you're saying, there's an important distinction between people and person.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So like the hierarchy is not us as individuals, not even popular vote. It's the people as in the decision making process.
Exactly. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, as far as president, we need to change policy or procedure how who gets to have the king's or the queen's ear and who gets to have most influence on and on the king or queen, so to speak, and remind our rulers who they're really supposed to represent.
Yeah, the particular magistrates in a certain sense, right? So we were like, we can be very angry that, the president listens to this, right?
Yeah.
Or the senators listen to that.
Right.
And we could say that in actuality, they should be listening to somebody differently. This is very common. It goes all the way back. How's it the same worries under monarchy? That's what I just want to say. That the problems are similar. Chris, you want to get back to?
Yeah, let me ask this question a totally different way.
Yeah.
So, remember in image of a ship, when you've got the ship owner who is essentially functioning like an absolute sovereign.
Okay.
Right? So his decision goes. What happens when the ship owner is gotten drunk or tied up by the people who are on the ship and they're supposed to be listening to his command?
Mm-hmm.
In that case, when the person who is sovereign is unable or incapacitated, right? So they're unable to do their job because they're literally chained up or literally imprisoned or otherwise incapacitated, is that still an example of the type of absolute sovereignty that you're describing?
I see where you're going. It depends on what we mean by incapacitated here, right? So if it were literally impossible, right, for, say, the decision procedure to be active, in a certain sense that we'd say the sovereign's dead, right? Almost like the sovereign being in a comatose state or something to that effect, or being tied up and gagged. And then we'd say at that point then the sovereign's no longer ruling. But it's different from a sovereign, say, not acting, and even rarely acting, to say it is in fact incapacitated. So I'd have to see what the argument is, right?
So if I go with, I don't know your name is from, but let me tell the story that I think they're trying to tell.
Okay.
Is, you look at the United States now, you have, rightly or wrongly, I think this is the story, that you have a significant percentage of people, perhaps the majority, that want to see the country going in a certain direction, but for whatever reason, either because they don't have the physical power, or they don't have the guns, or they don't have the financial power, they can't actually move the country in the direction they want to. They're essentially like that ship owner who's tied up.
Yeah.
In those cases, if that were true, so if the empirical claims that they seem to be suggesting, if you grant those are true, at that point, does the U.S. still, or does the people in the U.S. still have the type of absolute sovereignty that you're talking about here? And then if the answer is no, would you see the situation as being one of divided sovereignty, or would you see sovereignty being placed somewhere else?
I would see it being deposed, right? So what would happen is it'd be like it's like Cromwell took over the monarchy, right? If you want to go back to the Hobbesian examples. It would be somebody has taken over the system, taken over authority wrongly, essentially. And they have undermined the popular sovereign in that regard. And so in that sense then, I'd still say the system that we have, in the sense of the system as a normative structure, right, would still be an absolutist system. It's just that somebody decided that they were going to place themselves, or some entity decided that it was going to place itself as the sovereign. Yeah, above it.
I like the drunken example, the drunken ship captain.
Maybe it was like 1905. Like, this is what it's going to be now. The president is going to represent this, and then there's going to be, so many people talk about shadow government and figureheads, and, essentially might be exactly what's going on.
Yeah, but these are worries that go back, right? So, these are not worries that are stuck just in our time. There's always been this sort of concern, no matter what form of government it is, that you have shadow governments pulling strings, and that the real king, queen, aristocracy, whatever, is not really doing the work, right? And I don't think it undermined absolute sovereignty with those, and it doesn't undermine it here, at least just the notion that the system is construed to provide an absolute sovereign system.
Right. Well, on that note, let's thank Dr. Courtland.
No, thank you. Thank you.
So if you guys could do me a favor, we are not supposed to have students for today. Allow the exceptions for us. If you could just make sure that your area is clean, put the food in the back of the trash can, I will